And we're going to be talking about our Bible reading today. So grab your Bible, head over to the book of 2 Corinthians. That's what we're reading in the month of April, 2 Corinthians. And April is a 5-Sunday month, which throws a wrinkle in our pattern.
Yeah, we don't have a fifth Sunday pattern.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we've been following this pattern. We're on the fourth week of the reading. We talk about applications, and Jeff and I are going to do that today, but that does leave us that fifth week. So we thought we would just kind of make that a free-for-all for everybody. If you'd like to go back and post some questions that maybe you've had about the read that you haven't shared yet, glad to talk about that. And if you'd like to share some applications with them, you can text that to me or to Jeff, and maybe we'll come back and work in some of your applications as well. So that's how we will use week 5 and encourage you to continue reading that. Or if you're ready, you can go ahead and peek ahead because Romans is coming. And we've had some heavy books all right in a row.
Yeah.
So
Romans. Could have used a 5-Sunday month for Romans.
Yeah, maybe so. Well, if you want to start peeking ahead and looking at Romans, that'll be okay too. So the problem we always have with the application segment of this is not with what to say, but with what not to say.
Yeah.
Because there's so much
that could be said.
Yeah, so much that could be said. I do want to think about that segment in 8 and 9 where he talks to them about this contribution.
Right.
So let's just work the background of that a little bit.
Yeah.
What's the contribution about? Because that's what he's covering in the 2 chapters, and then we'll narrow in on something specific there. But let's get that big picture first.
So the big picture of the contribution as Paul envisioned it, and this goes back to last month's reading, 1 Corinthians, right? Because it was mentioned in 1 Corinthians, Paul's just now bringing it back up to them
Chapter
again.
16, right at the end.
Correct. That's right. But the truth of the matter is the same collection that Paul's talking about shows up in several of his other letters as well. And the idea is that Paul at this time in his ministry is trying to bridge that perennial Jew-Gentile divide. And the idea is what Paul's trying to do is to get the Gentile churches that he is establishing and working with out around the Mediterranean world to give generously to Jerusalem Christians who are needy because of some circumstances that have prevailed there. And the idea is that will bridge the divide in that the Gentiles will learn to not look at the Jews as, a lesser people, or they've been rejected by God because of their rejection of the Messiah, but rather show respect for the fact that it was through Israel that the Messiah came, and without the Jews, there'd be no Christianity. Therefore, the Gentiles would not be saved. They learn to show the proper respect to the Jews and Jewish brethren in particular. Jewish brethren is the real goal. And on the flip side of the Jewish brethren, when they receive the generosity of Gentile Christians, will then in a sense be more open to accepting Gentiles as full brethren, saved by faith in Jesus Christ, just as they are. Because remember, the early controversy we talked about back when we were doing Galatians, even Acts 15, this long struggle of Jewish Christians thinking that Gentile Christians could only be saved if they were circumcised and kept other aspects of law of Moses. So this is part of Paul's trying to build actual relationship between the two sides.
Benevolence with a twofold purpose.
Yeah, to literally meet needs, but
help needy saints. But in this setting, there could be some other things.
Open each side's eyes to what they need or gain from the other.
And help to bring them together.
And that's the ultimate goal. That's right.
To make them one.
That's right.
So I think he's fearful in chapter 8 and 9 that commitments were going to fall through.
Well, that's it.
Maybe in light of the trouble they had been through.
That's exactly it.
So the letter seems to be sort of advance work. Hey, be sure you get this thing ready.
Yeah.
And
we're already behind schedule, as it were.
and as part of that, he brags on the Macedonian churches at the beginning of 8.
Which would be Philippi, could be Thessalonica. I mean, others that, we've already read the Thessalonian correspondence, but Philippi would certainly fall into that region. So we do know those church names. We also usually, we don't know what to do with Macedonia. We do know those churches.
Yeah. One of the things that impresses me about this segment, Paul talks about the great generosity of the Macedonian churches and using them, I think, to kind of motivate the Corinthians to do their part in this. But he accounts for that in verse 5 why it was that they had given so generously. And he
Right.
says, we weren't expecting this, but they first gave themselves to the Lord
Yeah.
and to us by the will of God.
Yeah.
And I just think that
It's a staggering phrase.
it is, but it puts some substance underneath this act of giving.
Yeah.
It wasn't just obligatory. The reason they were doing it was first and foremost because of their determination to serve Jesus. They'd given themselves to him.
Well, that's right. And when you think about what that phrase really means, it means they've so thoroughly bought into the plan of God and the will of God that for them, giving money is not really, in one sense, a sacrifice, even though they're giving sacrificially. But if this is what they live for, they don't live for the next vacation or any of the things that we typically want our money for, but they are so thoroughly absorbed with what can we do to further God's purposes in the world. And Paul's given them a perfect example where money is needed to accomplish this larger work in the kingdom of God. Since they were to give themselves to the Lord, that's why they live. That's what they think about. That's the desire they want to fulfill now, the will they want to accomplish. They're more than happy to part with their money to see this greater kingdom purpose accomplished.
Yeah, that backing up to verse 4, you made me think about this. He talks about them begging us with much urging, and I love this language, for the favor of participation.
They saw it as a privilege.
I worry sometimes that disciples see giving as sort of a spiritual tax, right?
That's right.
I'm obligated to do this.
At least it's not 10% anymore, right? I mean, it's a tithe or something.
Yeah. As opposed, for example, I think that when people give, for example, to help with an adoption.
Yeah.
And I've done that some. And nobody sees that as, this burden.
No.
It's this really cool thing.
Yeah.
To help a child be placed in a good home.
That's right.
That's really cool. And I think that spirit exists among these disciples. We get the joy of participating in the work. Maybe sometimes we forget what it is that we actually are giving to do.
Right.
And maybe that needs to be highlighted more, what it is that our funds are really being used for, because it's clear here where this is going.
Right. And they understood and were excited about what would be accomplished with this use of the money they're giving as opposed to whatever else they might have done with it.
And then too, I think maybe our struggle to give comes down to what he's talking about in verse 5, and that is about first giving ourselves to the Lord. If I'm in this for me, then giving is a tax. It's a struggle,
Right.
as opposed to it's all his anyway. I'm living to his glory. How could I help with his work? So there really is an important mind difference that changes everything, I think, about the way we
No,
give.
absolutely.
Well, let's go on and think about some other applications in this book. What we're really doing is just kind of picking some of our favorites today. And that is certainly true of chapter 11.
Mm-hmm.
We have a pretty ugly list, especially at the end of 11, where Paul just details some of his adversity that he had endured for the sake of the gospel. But one of the things I really have always been struck by is after going through things like being in danger of death and being shipwrecked and being beaten, he gets to 28.
Right.
He says, apart from such external things, there is daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern?
Yeah.
And when I read that, it strikes me that Paul really looked at his relationship with other disciples in a family way. That's, to me, family talk. Like if you had a child that was off out in the world doing the wrong thing, maybe abusing drugs, I mean, daily concern wouldn't be adequate to describe how we would feel about that and the burden we would feel.
Right.
And so Paul said, that's about how I feel about my brothers and sisters. When I hear about a problem at Corinth, now this is real.
Right.
When I hear about trouble in that church, it is a burden to me. It's what keeps me up at night. I'm concerned about you.
Right. And I think it's fascinating too that you kind of you highlighted verses 28 and 29 there at the end. Usually we think about Paul's physical suffering, which is the first part of that long list he gives. I think it's fascinating that he saves the non-physical suffering as almost like that's the climax of his list. And apart from all these other things, as though the physical sufferings, which we in some ways are most fearful of or most focused on, can't imagine being beaten that much, or a shipwreck. Oh, a ship, man, not knowing if you're going to drown or not as you float in the ocean there, lost at night. Just can you imagine the terror? But for Paul, the peak of the list is, the truth of the matter is you're always in the back of my mind. Just like, even when your kids are grown and gone, I reckon, there's still, you go about your daily life, but there's still something lingering in the back of your consciousness at all times that is a factor of your love and the fact that they really are one of the crucial things in your life, not whatever daily business you may be going about today.
Yep. And I think you could even, get down into the tall grass with this and think about the implications for relationships, because you would have to know someone to know that a spiritual struggle were going on.
Yeah.
Like pay attention enough to notice someone is missing. So have you ever had this experience where the church was forced to take some kind of disciplinary action, and the elders get up and they announce a name, and not only are you not grieved, but you don't even know who the person is.
Right.
That says something, I think, about the distance that can take place,
right,
even within a church family. And of course, who's going to feel the daily concern for a person I don't even know,
right,
in my family? And so that, to me, says something too about the nature of relationships as God intended, and the need to cultivate those kind of relationships where that concern would be there. So I've always been struck by the way he describes that there. Wow. And then 12 may be. Was it fair to say the most memorable of all the chapters in the book?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most preached on passages in the whole book. Whenever 2 Corinthians even is preached on or taught, this is certainly one of the most common places people go.
And for all the wrong reasons. because if we talk about 2 Corinthians 12, we're talking about Paul's thorn in the flesh.
Yeah.
And usually that debate gets consumed with,
what was the thorn?
What do you think it is?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those spots that I find myself encountering with increasing frequency where I am curious. I want to know more detail about what's going on. I want to know more detail about what it was that Cain did wrong, and so this place is like that too. I want to know what exactly this is. And yet at the same time, it may be that God intentionally doesn't tell us everything in these places, because it would be less effective if he did. So in this case, for example, with Paul's thorn in the flesh, if I was told what that was, maybe irritating brethren or whatever, the Judaizers.
Bad eyesight.
Yeah. Then my temptation would be to say, yeah, that's not my problem.
Yeah.
My problem's different. And then you know what we definitely do? My problem isn't just different, it's worse, because we have to one-up everybody, right? Yeah, I know what you've been through. Let me tell you how much worse I've had it, or my problem has been, which then I think kind of robs the teaching of its power. It's how we get around the teaching and say, yeah, but that isn't my situation.
Right.
So he leaves us in the dark.
Sure, absolutely.
And then goes on to talk about how God leaves the thorn.
Yeah.
And you wonder why God would do that to a guy like Paul. He's such a good guy, such a good worker.
Right.
Why would he leave the thorn?
Well, verse 9 gives the answer. God actually tells him that, right? He goes, Paul admits that he prays. Paul admits that he prays repeatedly, like you or I would if we really had something distressing or troubling, especially something that seemed to be inhibiting even our ability to serve the Lord. We would certainly be praying. And he says, verse 9, but he, and he being God here, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. It's about learning to depend upon the Lord rather than my own fitness and my own health and my own abilities to even serve God. When I have to serve out of pain or some sort of obstacle or hindrance or something that's kind of holding me back or seems that way.
And my inability to get rid of it.
Which itself shows my lack of power, my limits. That's exactly right.
It reminds me of that text talk we did with Jerry Strode.
Yeah.
Where he talked about at the worst moments of his illness, saying you get to that place where all that's left is you and God, and you realize that's all you have.
Yeah.
Right. And he said, the real enlightening moment is when you realize that's all I ever had.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the place Paul gets to here. The thorn isn't going away. It's just you and God, and you've got to lean on him and depend on him
Yeah.
for your strength to get you through. And that winds up being empowering.
Yeah.
Because now,
and liberating.
Yeah, because now I'm leaning on him,
Right.
and his power and
Right.
grace is sufficient to get Paul through.
Right.
And so what I love about this in verse 10 is then he said, I'm well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecution, with difficulties for Christ's sake. This is the ironic statement. For when I am weak,
Then I am strong.
then I am strong.
Right.
And I wonder if we can say that in our adversity, if we really get to that
Right.
place like Jerry did. You know what? It's just me and God, and I'm
Right.
going to lean on him, and he's going to get me through. And oddly enough, it is acknowledging that weakness that in turn will make us strong.
Right. And what I love too about David, about the fact that Paul closes 2 Corinthians with this personal description of his own predicament.
Personal tale of woe.
Yeah, and what he's learned out of it is that literally, I think Paul was trying to, even, show off or, show how spiritually he was to have learned this. He was trying to teach them, because remember, we first met the Corinthians last month, and even through 2 Corinthians, we talked, at the beginning of this month about the background of the book. The perennial Corinthian problem is to be impressed by worldly standards and look for worldly things. And so Paul is literally closing 2 Corinthians with a personal example of how he has learned what he was saying to them back at the very beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, when he was reminding them that God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame what is wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And that even includes apostles like Paul. And so Paul's kind of closing, as far as the canon will give us, his conversations with the Corinthians. He's actually closing these letters with his own personal example of the hard road he walked to learn that lesson personally.
Yeah. God would not let me be filled with pride. He let me suffer so I wouldn't be filled with pride, and learn to lean on him and depend on him for my strength.
Absolutely.
As we read these letters, it's amazing to me, as much as the world changes over
human nature is just,
yeah, it's the same stuff, and how relevant the letters are.
That's right.
Even to us today. Hence why the Spirit has preserved them for us to read. So why don't you give another read through this 2 Corinthians letter and ponder these applications? Maybe you'll see some other ones that you can share with us if you'll pass them on. That'll be week number 5 as we wrap up our work in 2 Corinthians.